The Secretary General of the International Energy Forum joins me now. Joe McMonigle is with me. Joe, I know it's been a busy few days. Thank you so much for taking the time.
No, it's great to be here. Thanks for your time today.
Now listen, I've managed to catch some of the great conversations that have been going on, but here, particularly when we look at the outlooks, the IEA, the IEF, OPEC, pulling all of that together, what was the highlight for you when we look at this year's comparison on outlooks?
Well, certainly having His Royal Highness attend and the ministers from the Congo, who's also the president of OPEC this year, and also the minister from Romania, that was a big attraction, I think, for a lot of the attendees. But and more importantly, the substance of the event was also, I think, quite meaningful and impactful. And I think the key takeaway for me, and I think for most of the attendees, is that we examined all of the outlooks that are out there and compared and contrasted them. And essentially what we discovered is the growing gap between the highest case scenario and the lowest case scenario to meet these net zero and 2050 goals in terms of oil demand. And basically, every year we've been doing this, is 12 years now, that gap has grown every year. This year, it's 105 million barrels a day. That's the size of today's oil market. So I think what that demonstrates is the great uncertainty. You know, we have these outlooks and these scenarios, you know, and they're based on very credible models, as some of our participants said, but the demand is not necessarily going anywhere, and it's not going to go anywhere unless we have a replacement fuel. And so I think that was the big takeaway, because if you're an investor or a company CEO who has to make capital allocation decisions, or a policymaker planning roadmaps on energy policy, that's huge uncertainty between the low and high cases. And so I think what we've coalesced around that, you know, maybe we need to, you know, have a general accepted accounting practices for modeling, and maybe have more a dialogue on the modeling itself. But also I think we need to make policymakers and the business community aware that these are very difficult challenges. We have to keep doing it, obviously, but it really depends on investing simultaneously in fossil fuels. Yes, fossil fuels, because the world is going to be relying on fossil fuels until at least 2040 or 2050, according to all the models. And investing in clean energy, more wind and solar, but also investing in technology and innovation, because that's the only way we'll be able to solve our climate crisis. The IEA technology report that came out in 2020 essentially said half of the emissions we need to address have to come from new technologies, or technologies that are not commercially viable. So that's why that's so important.
Now, of course, the IEF, very much the global home of energy dialogue. This is, you know, what you like to talk at here, and you're kept busy making sure you're part of that dialogue. But talk to me again about how important, perhaps, and even more important, that dialogue is now, because it almost appears that everybody is not listening to the same dialogue sometimes, and everybody has their own dialogue. How do we bring that together? And indeed, what role can you play?
Well, the energy crisis that we've seen in Europe and also Asia, with high natural gas prices and of course oil prices approaching $100 a barrel, have really focused people's minds and policymakers' minds on the need for dialogue. And in fact, the G20 leaders, when they gathered in Rome, the communique gave the IEF a mandate to conduct what they said an intensive producer-consumer dialogue on energy security and energy access. And of course, access is actually a big problem right now in Europe, not just in the developing world. But how do we do that and at the same time, you know, aggressively pursue the energy transition, energy efficiency, and all these other clean energy goals that really help us address global warming. And so this was the start of that initiative. We will probably do a lot more in the months ahead. We have some big events coming up in June, another big event, ministerial meeting in the fall. And so each one of these events are going to have some kind of program to address this request from the G20 leaders.
And of course, investment was definitely a key topic because, even to the point where somebody said it is all about the money, and in terms of what money people will pay to get access to energy, what money needs to be paid for investment and that. But it's tough because there's almost a dual path in terms of what people need to invest in. Even the oil companies, they need to be investing in keeping the lights on today and then keeping different lights on tomorrow. So we've got, how do you find that at the moment, that uncertainty that's in the market, but also I suppose that there's almost a conflict there. Hopefully it's narrowing.
Well, look, even before COVID, investment in the energy sector and hydrocarbons was really struggling mainly because there was the lack of returns. I mean, investors found better returns in technology or healthcare sectors. And so the industry was struggling and just trying to come out of that phase, and then of course COVID hit, and that created great uncertainty. So what did you see? You saw, energy companies, and not just private, but state-owned companies, especially in the first year, cut their CapEx spending in new investment in new upstream projects by about 25%. We saw the same thing this past year in 2021. This year, we're still not seeing the state-owned companies are coming back, but the private companies, in the U.S. and the international oil companies are still being a little careful and cautious. And obviously, you have to spend billions and billions of dollars of shareholders' money, and you have to defend that. And when there's such great uncertainty, you understand their hesitancy. But the IEF, when I started in August of 2020, and one of the first things I wanted to do because of COVID was to look at this, what I thought would be an investment crisis because of the cuts in capital spending. So in the December of 2020, we issued our first report on the investment crisis with Boston Consulting Group and identified these big issues. This past year, we released a follow-on report with IHS Markit and Dan Yergin, and we found basically the same types of issues. The industry is basically spending about $350 billion a year, and we basically estimated that they really need to be about $550 billion every year for the next decade, essentially, to get us back to being able to meet demand. Now, that seems like a big number, but we heard one of the speakers today say that $550 billion should be $1 trillion if we're going to meet the population growth in Africa and the developing world. So our number is, may not even be enough, but it's certainly more than what's happening now. And when we issued the first report in December of 2020, not many people paid attention to it. Of course, oil prices and natural gas prices were not where they are now. Now people are starting to pay attention to it. The report got a lot of focus, but I think it's important that we spend, the energy crisis should be a warning. We shouldn't let the climate crisis turn into an energy crisis, because I'm very worried about high prices and volatility undermining public support for the energy transition and climate change. If the public starts to connect those two, we're doomed, because it'll undermine public support and it'll be very hard to get back.
Also, I think a lot of what people were talking about too, there was a lot of talk in terms of access to energy. This, again, something that's very much on your agenda, but I think I have, at this event, really heard a lot more awareness probably from so many people, and again, it's a huge concern, and I think it's maybe something that more people are beginning to understand. Do you think?
That's right. I mean, we hear a lot in the climate and energy transition discussions about stranded assets. In other words, stranded assets of hydrocarbon, power and energy facilities. But I think we have to be worried also about stranded lives. And 600 million people today don't have access to any kind of energy. And as we heard today, to cook, they're using wood or any kind of biofuel that they could get. And that results in about 6 million deaths a year. And again, mostly women, because they're cooking the food from the pollution. So this is a serious problem. The ministers from Africa, I was just in Cairo at a conference there. We had the minister from Congo here today. At another meeting, I was with the minister from Nigeria. I'm going to be seeing them in about 10 days. The ministers are starting to speak up about this. And the next COP meeting will be in Egypt later this year, and the next one will be in the UAE the following year. And I think you're going to see a shift in focus on some of these topics. And I think energy access and energy poverty is going to be very, very high at the top of the list.
So lots and lots of work for you in the next, not just a few months, but indeed the next few years. One other thing, of course, here as part of this annual event, you have the KAPSARC Leadership Roundtable. And again, this brings a lot of great thinkers in the industry, a lot of great experts, and again, a lot of analysts here together to really look at some pressing issues. Where is first of all, the cooperation that's there is very important to you, I know, but where again are the highlights from what we were listening to on that?
Well, KAPSARC is one of the leading think tanks in the world, and they have a lot of international researchers, and all of their research is peer reviewed, and so it's a great organization, even though it's based here in Riyadh, for us to partner with. And so we've done this 7 years in a row. We always do it in conjunction with the Outlook Symposium because the same type of attendees attend both events. What we wanted to do today is step back from the immediate concern about outlooks and look at more of the solutions, the technology and innovation that's going to help us meet our climate goals. And I referenced this IEA technology report in 2020 that said half of the emissions that we need to address have to come from new technologies and technologies that we know about but are not commercially viable yet. And that's where we need to be focusing. And we encourage our member countries and companies to really invest in clean energy R&D. Because that's where the solutions lie. I've been very complimentary of my home country, not because they're my home country, the United States, but because the Biden administration has quadrupled funding for clean energy R&D. President Macron in France has announced this new industrial policy that is very focused on zero-emission nuclear power plants and clean energy. And Italy has done a similar move with their economic development efforts. And we want to encourage all member countries to focus more on clean energy R&D. I kind of feel like we don't need to be worrying about the deployment of wind and solar anymore. If we're in a universe where there's finite public resources, we have to figure out, what's the best way to use those resources. And for the energy transition and addressing global warming, it's this clean energy R&D. And so if you can do both, that's great. But we really need, and the countries, I think, have a particular role here because companies are certainly going to do their part on clean energy R&D and have huge budgets for it. But the riskiest type of research, countries have to take that on. And that's where you're going to get your breakthroughs. And so we'll be doing more on this. We'll probably come out with a tracker of countries on clean energy R&D funding that we'll be doing later this year. And certainly in every event I go to, I'm encouraging countries to do more in clean energy R&D.
And just before you wrap it up, you have a busy year ahead where it's still only February, so we're still in the springtime. Just to bring us up to date with the expectations that we can see from the IEF. You have several meetings, you have several gatherings. Just remind us, what's on the calendar for the year ahead?
That's right. So we will do our annual event with the European Union. We do an IEF European Union forum, very similar to the events today, but focused on issues between the EU and other IEF member countries and common goals and objectives. It's no surprise that green energy, green hydrogen and technologies, the carbon circular economy that countries in the Gulf are interested in, all of these topics get really discussed. And I think, to tell you the truth, last year it was a virtual meeting, but I think for the first year we had representation by ministers and from the EU on the Commission level. And I think it was the first time that the EU Environment Commissioner, Frans Timmermans, and His Royal Highness met, although it was virtually, and now they'll be meeting in person soon. So that's the next big event. We will do also this summer an event with the Global Association of Risk Professionals. All these companies now have chief risk officers because you have not just investment risk, but you have energy and climate risks now to take into account. So we've been doing a series of workshops with them over the past year. This will be an in-person meeting that we'll do in conjunction with some of our other IEF, governing board and industry advisory board meetings. And then the big one, of course, is the one that we do every 2 years. It's been pushed off because of the pandemic, but Saudi Arabia will host the IEF-17 ministerial meeting, and this is where close to 70 energy ministers will gather and discuss a lot of these important issues. And it will be very critical because it'll be the lead up to the COP meeting. And energy is much more a focus, and energy supply, as we saw these last 2 days. I don't care, what your net zero period is to reach your goals. Every country now is talking about energy supplies and getting energy supplies. And so that will probably be a key focus, energy security, but also the transition. We'll get very much into transition and the discussion of ESG and other topics like that. So that'll be a big event. And Saudi Arabia, because we're based here, I think people think Saudi Arabia hosts it every year, but they don't. It'll be 15 years since they've hosted a previous one, and it'll be here in Riyadh, so I'm sure it'll be quite special.